Welcome Internet. Today we're going to be talking about the topic of the gaze in psychosis. So very fundamentally, I want to talk about it from three different perspectives. From basically the gaze of society onto the psychotic individual, the gaze that the psychotic individual experiences from others, and thirdly, the gaze of the psychotic individuals themselves. So before we begin properly this video, I just want to say that in this video I'm going to use psychosis as a generic and general term to mean people who experience a detachment from reality. And that detachment is in many types of psychopathologies, right? It's not just schizophrenia or paranoia. It can exist in a plethora of other conditions. The idea here is really that there's a subjective experience in which something of a mental construct exists on the same level as common reality, meaning that it has as much weight in the perception of the individual as what, let's say, classic reality has. Therefore, it can be a hallucination, it can be a delusion, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that there's a break between the experience, the collective experience of reality, and that of the individual, very simply. And I'm not using this term to mean like it's chronic. It's not necessarily always the case. Sometimes psychotic elements can occur, but only very sporadically. Like, for example, in certain types of personality disorders, there can be very small moments of psychosis, but that doesn't mean that the individual has a chronic form of psychosis. Anyway, I hope that was clear in this explanation. Now, so let's start with the gaze of society. The way society looks at psychotic individuals is in a very, very rejecting way. It oscillates between a fear of psychotic individuals and what they can do to others, with often representations that are all coming out of movies or are inherited from some form of true crime phenomena, where one extreme case of one individual with psychosis is going to be used as a general outlook for every single individual with the condition. The idea here is that society oscillates between immense fear and disgust for those individuals, especially when their behaviors are non-conforming, right? So there is an incredibly violent gaze that is given by society onto these people. And often it's also part of the work of a mental professional to be able to, when we meet people, to be able to deconstruct this gaze of society within them. Because most people that are not psychotic or not mental health professionals do not really understand the subtleties, and they often are prisoners of this misconception that has occurred through diverse media or true crime stories and so on and so forth, meaning that they need someone to be able to tell them that this is not a realistic picture, or if it has occurred, to explain that this is only a very rare occurrence within these conditions. So there's a whole gaze of society which I think does play a lot of role in how rejected psychotic individuals are towards the system, and how the system in a way is also complicit in letting them be marginal and get marginalized even further. And there's a whole process, in this case, of dehumanization, in which a psychotic individual is dehumanized because of his mental illness. Therefore, I think that it's very important not to forget this cultural and social aspect of the illness, because it's something that the psychotics do talk about and can be very true. It's something in which they often are hurt and basically abused because people are afraid of them. Therefore, that fear turns into hatred, and then hatred turns into violence towards them. So I think it's something that's important to keep in mind. But it's not the only gaze that occurs in psychosis, because often during acute moments of psychosis, the individual can feel terrified by others, and that terror is going to be often expressed through the idea of the gaze. They're looking at me, they're seeing me, they're perceiving me. Often that perception of others, because it cannot be controlled, is something that the psychotic individual can seem as extremely dangerous, as it's basically can be the surface projection of their own constructs, that they can project their own inner affairs that they have towards others onto others. So here it doesn't go against the idea of society having a strict gaze or a rejecting gaze. This is more to say that their subjective experience is this fundamental fear of the gaze of others, because the gaze of others sometimes is experienced by the psychotic as something that can penetrate them, that can rip apart the defenses and come and mold them. Therefore, they have to protect themselves. Sometimes they hide, they, like for example, take a blanket, completely cover themselves, even though it might be like 40 degrees Celsius outside, they're still going to put on a blanket to hide. They might basically put on multiple layers of clothes to stay hidden. They might only leave their apartments at night, and so on and so forth. The idea here is that they feel a deep sense of persecution by the gaze of others, and that gaze is often filled with intent. Even if the other individual, and this is important, does not realistically have that gaze or have those ideas, the psychotic individual is basically replaying all of the bad elements that comes up into their minds, all the toxic or hateful relationships that they've had, and they project it, they throw it onto another individual because it's too hard to bear by themselves. In a way, the relationship of them with their bad internal objects is so massive, so basically absolute, that there is no other way than to try and project, to throw it out onto others, and that's what's coming back. And sometimes it can also be basically their own intent that is seen through the other as a mirror, but they're not aware of that, not consciously at least. So therefore they put it onto the other, and they're convinced. It's not a question of they can take a step back. They're really convinced that the other one wants to hurt them, wants to rape them, wants to destroy them. Therefore it becomes very complicated to disentangle that, because in their subjectivity, they're not lying, they're not miscalculating, they're not misinterpreting. The truth is something that imposes itself upon them, as the gaze of someone imposes itself upon them. So it's in a way, in a completely phenomenological perspective, we can see that the gaze of the other, because they cannot control it, then opens up in them a part of themselves that they can't control either, as a form of response to the gaze. So something inside of them is going to respond with immense fear, because it's a fear of being destroyed by all the negativity that's brought up with the gaze. And we also have to remember that the gaze, even though common people look at each other without a problem, for psychotics it's a very, very intense experience, because in the eyes there's something very special. It's the first way of apprehending the world, right? It's we see things. For most of us that are, for example, not blind or are not born blind, we see the world. That's our first experience. We look at things. And I think that, for example, this idea that the eyes are the representative of the soul is a very interesting idea, because it shows how intense eyes and gazes are, and that might be too intense for the psychotic individual already dealing with a lot of suffering to just take in. And there's also this fear that they might be molded by the gaze of others, that if the other sees them as evil, wrong, or unnatural, that they will become evil, wrong, and unnatural, meaning that they have to fend off against it. Often they have to push others away, both figuratively and sometimes literally, to try and avoid that feeling of being molded by others. Because what you have to understand is that psychotics aren't a relationship, right? They do, like I say, benefit from having relationships with others, but the problem with that relationship is that they feel that they can lose themselves in the relationship, and the gaze is too transformative for them. Because, as you know, when basically we all influence each other, and the way others look at us also defines us in a certain aspect. Not completely, we can change and we can revolt, and we can do a lot of things to prevent it from shaping us, but it still shapes a bit of us, nevertheless. And in psychosis, it's even worse than that the gaze is so powerful that it might transform them completely and radically. Therefore, they have to protect themselves. And they might also see in others their own intent, and that's even more complicated, because then they cannot differentiate between themselves and others, as if both were merged in a collective, in a form of fundamental non-separation aspect between themselves and the outside world, i.e. it's not me and here's the outside world, it's me and the outside world are merged, therefore there's no difference, and that's terrifying, because where subjectivity starts and where it ends is one of the most important and fundamental aspects of fundamentally our human experience. Not knowing where it starts and where it ends is terrifying, because what you know, what you have control over, or what you don't. Therefore, the gaze is so fundamentally anguishful for psychotic individuals. Now, I'm going to end with this question of the gaze of psychotics themselves. Often their gaze can be very intense, to the same intensity in which they feel others see them, and often it's a protection towards a perceived threat. Like, for example, they might look at people with very strong intent, very intimidating, and that can be something that we hear from people working in, for example, hospitals or in clinics. It's very, very intense, and they have the feeling that the psychotic individual might hurt them or attack them. Not that they ever will, but it's that fear that they feel inside of them, and they are having that form of look in a way to not get bothered or disturbed or hurt by others. Therefore, the gaze is so strong in order to push away the other people from themselves. They can also have, very interestingly enough, a gaze that in French we call adhésif, meaning that it sticks. And I've always felt that that type of gaze towards healthcare professionals was like a form of continuing their existence. It's like, please don't let me go, as if they were holding on to the professional through the gaze, that they were like using their eyes and their sight as hands, say, I don't want you to let me go, I don't want to let go of this, I'm afraid of not being able to cope on my own, and to fall, and to not be able to get up. And therefore they look at the therapist or the healthcare professional as a form of primary caregiver when the child is very, very young, basically as guaranteed the survival through the caregiver, through the professional. And I found that to be very interesting, because it shows how important the relationship with others is for these people. And lastly, they can have a gaze that's quite absent. In these cases, it's often people that have withdrawn, psychotics that don't want to deal with the world, but only deal with themselves in a form of catatonia, in which their gaze is just gone. And it seems that in those moments, it's a final, as Lang would say, a final defense mechanism to try and save what's genuine inside of them without being transformed or hurt or brutalized by the outside world. And that's what I found to be very interesting, is that even in psychotics themselves, the gaze has a role, it has a function. As they see it in others, they can then sometimes use it for themselves to or protect, or try and save the relationship, and save themselves by extension, or, and this is important, or forego that gaze and just have a complete shutdown. Anyway, that's pretty much it for the video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, anything you'd like to ask, feel free to do so in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.